So I want to do a kind of basic run through of what the process for meditation is. And I know I've done that a couple times, but really it's really the gist of the whole thing here, and I think you really need to be able to visualize this from a kind of a neuroscience standpoint, because if you're doing this process without really understanding, there's kind of quotes and spiritual things that sound pretty straightforward in terms of letting go of the self and detaching from thought and all that, but I think it's very useful to understand that, or understand how this process can be understood from just a purely scientific standpoint. As I've said, this is very simple, straightforward stuff, and so what happens, we're born into this world without any of the filter of the mind, any of the activity of the self, which creates this anxiety or separation that the human being has to deal with. And most people, and collectively as a species, as you can see, are so enveloped in this identity and this attachment to self-perpetuation and chasing the ego in a million different forms, that's commonplace. That's what is happening inside the modern mind for the vast majority of our species, is this incessant machine of the self that's attaching to one fear or desire or whatever kind of self-referential thought bundle comes by, and it really is just that. As far as what the science behind it, the default mode network is a pretty new discovery in terms of the research that they've done about it. And so what happens is, if you observe the human, I say that as if I'm not not one, but if you observe the human being, if they're engaged in a certain task, if you're at work or you're doing something that's kind of goal-oriented or task-oriented, there's a certain part of your brain that is associated with that task-positive network. But for the average person, if they stop and they're asked to just sit still and not do anything, we have something called the default mode network that comes online. And that is just the residual self-referential narrative that everybody has, that's been conditioned and built over years and years, in terms of what you are, who you are, what you don't have yet, what you need to get, what you don't want, what you do want. It's kind of just a continual machine that's it's ultimately just a sequence of thoughts, and it creates this anxiety that goes along with it, because the brain is creating a sense of self or it's perpetuating a series of thoughts that collectively form our sense of self. But there is no separate self. It's literally just those thoughts coming in continual succession. But it happens so quickly, and we've conditioned our minds so thoroughly into the brain that we really don't even notice it anymore. It's the movie projector analogy is one of the better ones, because it's if you look at the movie projector, it seems like there's one continual story going on the screen. It seems to be no interruption at all, and there's nothing else besides it. But what's actually happening is just a movie reel has different frames, and when that's moving at a fast enough speed, then it seems like there's just one continuous movie or entity. But that's just because of the speed of the movie reel. It's just a sequence of one frame or one picture, one story, one after another. And that's basically the same thing that the mind does. It's a sequence of thoughts, emotions, that over time builds this sense of attachment or separation anxiety, as I've said. Because I won't go down that road. So what happens when you look at people's brains from the default mode network perspective, you're seeing the activity of that machine, of the self, going at this great speed for the average person who doesn't meditate at all. And when you begin to meditate, then what you're doing is basically each one of those thoughts is just neurons firing in the default mode network. And they fire and they fire and they fire. And what generally happens is, some particular fear or anxiety that has a lot of charge to it or something, maybe it's work related, maybe it's a relationship or something like that. And that thought comes up. This person doesn't like me, or this, I hope this works out, whatever it might be. And so generally what happens is that neuron gets fired in the brain as a response to whatever actually happened. And you latch on to that thought and you attach to it and you begin to build and wire neural networks into your brain every time something like that happens. So when that thought comes up, you're feeding it, you're providing energy to that stream of thinking that perpetuates itself and reinforces itself in the default mode network. And so what the average person ends up with after, years or decades of living this way is a pretty tightly packed mess of neural networks that are just basically on autopilot. And if you stop to meditate, then you're faced with that machine, what you've been building all this time. And that's just because you've been putting so much energy and so much work into this thing to begin with. And so the brain's kind of like, well, that's what we do. Why wouldn't it be there? That's the way you've lived up to a certain point. And so when you enter the world of meditation, it's a complete 180 to that. And so as neural networks can be built over time and they collectively create this tension or dis-ease kind of just an inability to relax and flow with life due to their inherent nature, which is just unstable, and always means to an end oriented, and just one thing after another after another after another. And so what happens in meditation, neurologically, is just that you're not attaching to those thoughts. So whether you meditate or not, those thoughts are going to come up because it's just what's been stored in your brain thus far. That's what you're working with in terms of the story, in terms of the self that needs to be relinquished or let go of. So you don't have control of, kind of what's in the hard drive, but the purpose of meditation and where the shift happens is that you, instead of feeding this machine, you're just witnessing the machine. You're watching one thought go by, one neuron go by, one story go by, one neural network at a time, one by one by one. And that's and instead of latching onto that, you're just watching it. There it is, there it goes, it rises and falls away. And that, by its very nature, is removing the fuel or the energy that forms that neural network to begin with in the default mode network. So those slowly get wound down over time. Each time you sit down and meditate, a little bit more gets, a little bit more of that story gets let go of, and the energy no longer flows down that path. And that's generally pretty uncomfortable to begin with if you're just starting out with meditating, and even further along in it as the stakes get a bit higher. But just you have to consider the momentum of years or decades of mental energy all going in one direction, and then you just stopping it or refusing it. So there's some discomfort with that at times, not always, but just sort of the whining child of your self that wants to go down. We love to do all this mental gymnastics and maneuvering and self perpetuating thought processing, and so that muscle has to slowly be let go of and relinquished. So yeah, it's pretty useful to understand that, because it's, you can almost take a step back from yourself when you're meditating, and you can kind of think of it almost as just like a self surgery that you're doing on your own brain, or part of your own brain, the default mode network. So you're literally at a point you can step back as the witness and just notice that story went by, that story went by, that thought went by. I didn't go with it, and and this has been measured, and research studies have been done on it. That neural networks and neurons will stop firing over time as you refuse to engage them, as you usually do. And it's just basic biology, basic kind of process like anything else in the world. If you keep doing it, it perpetuates itself. If you remove the energy from it, then it slowly goes away. And there's a threshold that gets reached during this process, which is referred to as non-duality or enlightenment, or God or infinity, whatever word you want for it. And that's basically just a return to our natural state of what we once were before the default mode network, before the self came in with all of its insatiable activity, endless activity that it does. And that's basically the default mode network just collapses in on itself, or the self collapses, or just that machine of seeking and thinking and analyzing and all of that has just been dissolved, really, by the very act of meditation itself, which, as I've said, is just a detaching and a refusal of those thoughts, or a refusal to engage with that particular networks of the brain, which, as I've said, that comes up automatically through meditation. You don't have to worry about what the thoughts are and this one special thought that seems like it's the most important thing in the world. That's fine, whatever it is, no matter how horrible and shitty it is, or no matter how self ego aggrandizing it is, it doesn't matter. Just keep letting them go, one after another after another. And there is, a finite amount of neurons or self-referential thoughts that are stored in the brain. So it's just a question of time and how much mud you've got to settle in the mind, as Lao Tzu said a few thousand years ago. So, that's the process, start to finish. It's do it yourself. It's as simple as it can be, but there's got to be a willingness to see this process and understand the cause and effect of what our mind does to ourselves, what our mind does to us, and what it's doing to this world collectively. And we need to understand that thoroughly and scientifically, as that makes it a lot more able to be visualized and proved and all that, which just kind of removes our doubt initially as far as why we won't do it. So I hope that makes sense. Any questions or feedback, let me know.